Is that good? Someone is really noisy in their microphone. Can you?
I think it's you, Ben.
Yeah, I'm just trying to turn it. I'm just trying to. It's disappeared now. This stupid thing. I hate Zoom.
Ben's got his like FM radio out.
No, it's the fan. It's the fan from the thing. It's just because Ableton's been running, and so the fan hasn't cooled down a bit. Ableton, I tell you, Ableton 11 just trashes my computer.
Ableton and all the Bitcoin mining.
Yeah, all the
Is it?
Bitcoin mining. That's right. Yeah.
You
It's
mining
mostly just
Bitcoin?
Ableton to be. I'm not mining Bitcoin. It's Ableton. I tell you, it's probably mining Bitcoin in the background
No
because
one mines Bitcoin anymore.
yeah, there's non-fungible tokens, man. There's 650k for a piece of art.
Rage these days.
Yeah.
Okay,
cool.
guys.
Thank you, Zach, for doing this.
Yes, I'm very happy. It will actually help me as well. And actually, so Ben, now that you're here, I'm likely to upload this to YouTube if everything works well. So if you enter conversation, behold, you might become public. But I do appreciate every comment and kind of whatever you guys come up with, because this is going to be rather, I don't know what to call it. You'll tell me what it was like afterwards, all right? Cool, so here we go. Excellent. So welcome, people. I'm doing a talk on prospects of unconventional audio signal processing, which is a topic that I see exploding in the future. Partly because, I mean, there's many reasons really, but unconventional computing in itself is an area of research that has exploded recently. And I think I'm very lucky to have direct acquaintance with Andy Adamatsky, who is one of the main figures in this field. So a lot of the stuff that I've been doing in this domain has been inspired by his work. I have to admit that my understanding of all the intricacies of unconventional computing is just very basic. There's quite a lot of things going on with weird ways of computing stuff. Yeah, I'll talk about, I'll essentially divide up my talk into 4 chapters. And the first chapter is going to be rather philosophical. Second one will be more broadly relating to the arts domain. The third one, I will briefly just talk about signal transmission and substrates, because that's the entry into this domain for me, in terms of it being the simplest things in processing audio, right? So we are kind of getting to audio signal processing with all this, to actually get to audio signal processing in the 4th chapter. So it will be a more of well, it's actually kind of a wish list thing that I'm presenting, because I'm looking at the usual audio signal processing, and I can come up with, you know, in my imagination, I see the ways that non-silicon devices could do similar things. And you will see, I actually also think that the kind of precision and the analytical approach that we typically have in this domain is fair, but not necessarily the best for an artistic type application. Okay, so here we go. Well, the first thing is the subtitle that I came up with, because Andy is fairly explicit about being subversive towards established science. And this is something that I totally resonate with. I am kind of convinced by this postmodern idea that, you know, you cannot really work against the system. Once the system, whatever that is huge and overarching, it is actually undefeatable. So every attempt to subvert the system only fortifies it. And I believe we are living in this age since a while. And therefore and obviously it's a cultural background related thing as well. So for me, the way I am motivated is by trying to find gaps. Okay, so rather than building on top of existing pyramids, I'm interested in finding gaps somewhere lower in the structures. And this is an interesting thing because it kind of, well, it just serves me quite well in that sense. So obviously in my current attempt to subvert certain things about unconventional computing, I have chosen the subtitle Conventional Uncomputing. And I'll talk about why I think this may be a valid approach in this sense. Okay, so first of all, I would like to talk a bit about truncating phenomena. Okay, so the way we describe stuff that we experience tends to slice it up, right? So the reductionist paradigm tells us that, you know, if you know how the components operate, you shall know how the sum of the components operate, right? This is the kind of linear connection of things, right? Now, it is quite interesting to read and follow the current research in behavioral biology. Most specifically, Robert Sapolsky is one of the people who makes it a bit more accessible to non-experts. And he actually has quite a lot of examples where this reductionism, where basic kind of strict causality actually collapses in biology. Okay, so in a sense, it is emerging, the idea is emerging that as soon as the system gets a bit more complex, because all the so-called elements are interactive, it tends to become unpredictable very soon, which is the kind of characteristic of chaos, and most of the recursive relationships or interactions will produce chaos. So it's only predictable in a very limited extent. So one of the underlying ideas in terms of uncomputing is, first of all, understanding the truncation of phenomena and trying to avoid it as well, as much as you can. So I have a few things here, a few examples. I'm actually, one of the things I was thinking recently, I would probably have to consult a subversive physicist about this. But I was actually thinking about thermodynamics and the idea of temperature and pressure. Okay, so actually what we have is a very tight relationship between these two units. But I'm interested whether it could be challenged, the idea that they are separate to start with. Okay, so I mean, it's evident for us that, you know, if I'm hot, I'm sweating, and if I'm cold, I'm shivering. And if the pressure is really high, then my ears feel the pressure. And if it's really low, then I cannot breathe. So for a human, right, being, it is fairly obvious that these are separate. But actually, I do think that we can produce models whereby these are not necessarily separate. Another interesting relationship, a similar relationship, which I'm probably more inclined to know some details on, is the relationship between time and frequency. Okay, so similarly, you know, we hear frequency with the ear, and some of us have a watch or, you know, on-screen clocks. So for a human, it is a really, you know, obvious thing to separate these two as different domains. But if you start looking into what it takes for something to have a frequency, you find that you cannot separate the time out of this concept. So what I'm trying to look at is ways of building different models of reality that are less separatist, if I can use that word in this context. Okay, so I think that that's an interesting approach, because in art, in music, we actually work with the overarching sensation and impact, impression, rather than the elements that constitute it. So in a way, when I feel that a piece of art is wholesome, it is not wholesome because it constitutes of these elements. It is wholesome for myriad reasons, including the whole past of my, you know, life and how I grew up and all the rest of that. So I'm trying to find ways to avoid this truncation in terms of naming orthogonal dimensions. Okay, so that's one thing that kind of underlies this uncomputing idea, the idea that the computing itself is not necessary. Obviously, you know, we enjoy the tech that we have and the computing brought us here. But again, you know, our ability to approach the body of science with a subversive attitude may indeed improve our understanding and figure out where we are, what we are holding tight onto, which is not necessarily there to hold tight onto, but we can kind of make it a bit more loose. Okay, so that's a kind of a broader thing there in terms of truncating phenomena. And then a more specific thing in terms of truncation that is probably a bit easier to tackle is how we truncate time and how we produce measurement. Now, in terms of measurement, I mean, it's kind of obvious that, you know, everything that you measure, you alter by measuring it. So again, this inevitable interaction, this inevitable connectedness between things comes back up again. So it is evidently, you know, the amount that the measuring device modifies what you measure is negligible and all the rest of that. But what I do find is that the paradigm that we live by, the way we think about these things, excludes these interactions. Okay, so in a way, you know, the cognition latches on to what is easy. In fact, I've seen some interesting lectures from physicists who were talking about why is it so that we consider that a simpler theory is more true than a complex theory. Okay, because this is not, you know, it's almost like an assumption that we live by. And in that sense, it is an interesting thing to dig into, because the other thing that we seem fairly convinced about is that there will be a model of reality which will actually cover the reality. Okay, so and that is a kind of a drive which takes us further into devising more precise models. And it is an open question whether that will yield or not. I mean, I really don't know, but what I can do is I can reflect on this process. And also what I will try to reflect on as a whole is the idea of achievement of achieving a goal. Okay, but before I get there, just briefly about how this model supposedly relates to the reality. It supposedly covers it, explains it, and predicts it fully. And that model is supposed to be a fixed representation. Okay, whereas it seems that the reality around us is more fluent than fixed. And in fact, our window of investigation is rather small compared to what we assume is the duration of history before us and the potentially infinite future. But even these terms, I think, are actually coming from basic, well, I could say misunderstandings. Actually, I call this, I'll probably show you more of this because all of these things kind of relate. So it is, to me, it seems, and actually it's not my idea. I think I borrowed it from Lakoff. George Lakoff is one of the thinkers that inspires me quite a bit. In fact, a scientist. He has the book Where Mathematics Comes From and Philosophy in the Flesh. So he takes these scientific fields and approaches them, well, to put it simply, as if, he actually tries to explain why a monkey would come up with math and why a monkey would come up with philosophy. And I find that a really, I mean, maybe a bit provocative, but I don't actually find it provocative. I do think that studying monkeys, primatology, is one of the most exciting things around. Because we have evidence that, in terms of brain functions, the kind of neurons we have, brain regions, all of the hardware is very, very similar. But we understand that the software is rather more developed in humans. And Lakoff and a bunch of scientists around him, they're essentially claiming that that we don't really, that there is no special faculty for abstract thinking, for example. But instead, the brain that picks bananas and messes up its social life and struggles for ranking, the kind of primate business brain, uses the same essential circuits, uses the same functions in a different way. But and it's that's why I find it very fascinating, and especially because these people, they actually go into this in much more detail, and it's really a bunch of convincing arguments to me. Okay, so briefly back to this model relationship to reality. I would invoke a metaphor of a droplet of water, which can actually reflect the whole environment pretty much, if you really zoom in, so to speak. But this droplet of water is a subset of the whole environment. So it's a really tough call to try to make it such that it actually reflects the whole environment. Okay, and this kind of subset superset relationship I find to be not sufficiently present in the thinking, in our paradigm, because in cognition we have a similar thing, that the awareness is the subset of the mind, and the awareness is pushing for the control of the mind. So we again have this struggle between subset and the superset, whereby the subset really feels like, or has to cover everything. And that, going back to primatology right now, that is really obvious in the sense that it's increasing the ranking of the monkey. Okay, and in fact, in personal reflections, I believe I can explain 90% of my behavior by considering it to, essentially just push my ranking, including my career, including researching this stuff. All of this has a sense of increasing my ranking. And some of these scientists, so I should probably mention Gazzaniga as well, they're fairly adamant about this behavior being limbically driven, right? So in a way, what we have is limbical drive, and we have cognitive regulation of the drives. And the proof, the evidence for these claims actually comes from defectology. So when, for example, a person has lost the ability due to lesion of the brain or a stroke, many possible factors there. You also drugged, obviously, the ethics don't allow for the kind of stuff they were doing 100 years ago. But what you get then, if a person is not able to emotionally attach to its environment, then there is no outcome of a thinking process either. So the outcome of a thinking process, the conclusion, is actually an emotional catharsis. And if one has lost sense of this emotion, one doesn't chase this cathartic emotion, then a thought never completes itself. You can go on about anything forever. So it's actually an emotional drive that really pushes us into what most people call rationality, because this idea that I achieve a goal because it is good for this or that, by default, we think that this is a rational drive, that it makes sense. But actually, a lot of this research, what it does, it shows how the explanation of this behavior comes after the behavior. So typically, most of our justifications, most of our reasonings, I should say, most of the reasonings are justifications for what we do anyway. And in fact, there is some thinkers who would suggest that every thinking process is essentially a kind of a exploding intuition. Okay, this must be right. And then we go into figuring out why it is right. Okay, and this brings me back a bit into this subversion topic, because what I find increasingly in the academic environment, that people are essentially just justifying what they're thinking. And I would say that the academic attitude necessitates attempt to prove a thesis, and the same amount of effort to disprove the exact same thesis. So we are kind of suffering from too much marketing, because in the marketing world, what you have is prove, this is the case, this is what has to, this is true, right? Whereas typically a way to recognize a good academic inquiry is that there is no truth in there. There is no right and wrong. You can open up many interesting questions and, produce arguments around both ideas, kind of opposing polarities. But as soon as there is an outcome to such an antagonism, typically it smells like marketing already. Okay, and we're kind of inclined to market our research as well, right? With all the, push to publish stuff, and I'm right about this, I'm right about this, they were right about this, right? So the amount of references we receive has everything to do with how many people think that we were right about something. Okay, so that's a very tricky situation, because it actually defies the core principle of science, which is skepticism. Obviously, you can never progress without some assumptions. You kind of get through things and get going. But I think that if skepticism is deeper in the attitude of scientists, then the sand has the potential to grow in many different directions. Whereas currently it is more like building a pyramid. So it's actually heading in the same direction, and there is very little movement on the sides. And that's why unconventional on computing is so exciting, because it's, you know, it's trying to do things which are so simple to do with silicon, and it's trying to do it with totally unrelated things. In fact, it's trying to come up with many possible ways of doing this, which is more inefficient, more expensive. All the reasoning is against it. But in a way, there is a really deep scientific intent in doing this. Okay, another thing which is a really interesting challenge to the way most of us think is the idea of memory and content. In fact, cognitive scientists have established that there is no memory in the brain and there is no content, which kind of makes sense because neurons are there anyway. They die out after a while, they're repaired, they're born, they're eaten up by these other cells once they're totally dead. There is no empty space to be filled with something that is not there. So actually this whole idea of how memory functions and how we grow into, you know, people who can do a lot of different things, you can actually explain this whole phenomenon through increased ability to react to the environment. So the pool of responses grows. Okay, but there is no empty space that is filled, and there is no such thing as running out of space either. Okay, so and that also tackles this, you know, this supposed surprise when people realize that, well, wait a minute, you know, this linear model can't work for the brain because, I don't know, maybe you know about the grandma neuron, which was kind of maybe 20, 30 years ago, it was a very interesting metaphor that was used to describe the issue of, I mean, first of all, the hierarchical operation of neurons, how when I see something, I actually have a layer of neurons that detect straight lines, and then a layer that would detect the inclination of those lines, layers that detect contours. And it seems to build up hierarchically to kind of deliver the top level perception. But there is no grandma neuron. Okay, so the fact is that immediately when I see my grandmother, I immediately know that it's her, right? So from this basic linear model, people used to suppose that, okay, well, somewhere up the hierarchy, there is this one thing that lights up and says, okay, this is the recognition that just happened. But that doesn't really, no one could find the grandma neuron. So this kind of, again, the idea, this reductionist idea that the components, understanding of the components will yield the understanding of the top level phenomenon, it just breaks down altogether. So in that sense, again, trying to go back to the unconventional computing or conventional uncomputing, can we come up with things that don't build on the idea of memory content? Obviously, all of our design of programs, procedures, algorithms rely quite a bit on the idea that there is a bit of, you know, empty space. I put something there, take it out, manipulate it, and all the rest of it. And actually, what I'm really trying to get to here, I'm trying to make a blur between the neurological computation and the mechanical computation or electronic, although you could call it mechanic based on the principles, in, at least for digital domain, because the delineation between neurological computing, biological computing, and mechanical computing is not a necessary thing. It's evidently, you know, at hand. It's kind of invites itself into the room. But I think I'm trying to propose that the agency of a thinker is not superior to the agency of a digital computer, because both are evolutionary products. Okay, so this questioning the agency that we have, or actually defining the agency that we have, is another crucial thing. And actually, you will find that increasing number of scientists are trying to defy the idea of free will. And I'm definitely on that side. I think we have well defined agency, but free will is a poetic term. It doesn't really hold altogether. So this amount of agency and where it comes from, I think it's fairly crucial. And I don't want to go too deep into this, but instead, let's go back to constructing the idea of uncomputing. Okay, so what are these postulates that would yield some deeper understanding of what I mean by uncomputing? So first of all, was the truncating of the phenomena. Is it necessary or is it not necessary? Okay. Now, second thing is this idea, something that I think I've borrowed it from somewhere, but I'm a horrible academic. I cannot quote most of the things that I've been inspired by, except a few. But the idea of unnecessary extrapolation. Okay, so the idea that a model is superior to the reality, and if the model is good, it will hold. Okay, well, evidently in history, we have a lot of models that have predicted something that was not experimentally proven and became experimentally proven. So I'm not trying to undermine that. But one thing that I would try to undermine, for example, are the concepts of infinity, the concepts of everything. Okay, so why? Well, again, primatology, advanced monkeys. I have 10 sheep in my herd, and it really makes sense to talk about all the sheep in my herd. Now, does it make sense to talk about all the molecules in my body? I wouldn't think so, because I'm constantly breathing. There's a constant flux exchange with the environment, right? I'm constantly sweating, especially now. So that's evaporating. So there's molecules escaping. I'm eating on a larger time scale. You know, I'm going to the toilet as well. And on an even larger scale, you know, all the cells have undergone some kind of multiplication, and all of them are quite likely to decay away into soil or otherwise. So again, what I'm trying to say here is that we have a sense of something works on a small scale, it must work on a large scale. Whereas there is evidence that these things do not necessarily hold. And in fact, the kind of theoretical physicists who name things as existent just because something's missing in the equation is really stretching it. I mean, in fact, I would very strongly promote the strict delineation between real things and concepts. And I find that in our culture, we are actually talking about concepts as if they were real. So we kind of mess these things up. Now, again, you know, you can really push this discussion into, okay, well, in terms of all my sensory input, can I be sure of anything being real beyond that? Or is that the ultimate, you know, depth of reality? obviously I don't really want to push it that far, but what I'm interested in is talking about systems, is talking about, well, essentially that systems which do not delineate, they don't truncate the phenomena, okay? And they don't produce an externalized goal which is measured through the truncation of the phenomenon. Okay, so it's that's what I'm really getting at here, is that the computation in itself has a sense of achievement, has a sense of, okay, this is the problem, these are the tools, and then combining those tools, I get a solution. Obviously, we have amazing technology which has arisen from that method. So I'm not trying to kill it all, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to reflect on it a bit more thoroughly, or from a greater distance, in order to offer alternatives, because I do think that the psychology of contemporary people is devastated by the sense of achievement. Okay, and actually in some areas of computation, we do have lesser presence of this achievement idea. So I can't really quote many things, but in analog computation, right, where you have to produce a circuit that is a close model to a problem that you're trying to solve, in these situations, what you typically had is operators who would turn the dials until the electronical circuit actually starts to operate in a desired way. Okay, but there it's very interesting, because it is likely the desired outcome is not clear in terms of truncated dimensions and values along different units. Similarly to art, right? So there is no, the piece of art is not finished when I can measure and it's of this dimension and there is these relationships between elements. But there is a kind of a wholesome appreciation of getting somewhere or having gotten somewhere. But I would actually promote to focus on the process of getting somewhere and calling that the uncomputation. Okay, so I'm not computing. Evidently, I'm building complex systems, but I'm not trying to achieve a measurable outcome. Okay, so this is what I mean by this unnecessary externalization of achievement, that achievement is externalized in space and time such that it's not present right now. But actually, while I'm producing some weird music, audio making, processing processes, I should say, that very activity is the achievement. That is what we're looking at in terms of doing what we do. Because if you assume that there is a very significant nonlinearity and unpredictability of complex systems, to strive for an outcome is not only questionable in terms of whether that outcome can be achieved, but it's also questionable in terms of whether it's worth trying, whether our projection of what the outcome may be has anything to do with the outcome. Okay, obviously, if you truncate it and you say, well, I wish to marry a lady who has 49 kilograms of weight, then indeed I can measure the outcome, okay? But there's plenty of ladies which weigh 49 kilograms, which I'm not attracted to, so it cannot define the success anyway, okay? So evidently I'm, all this time I'm talking about non-lab, you know, non-reduction of variables in the experiment. So, you know, as far as dropping marbles, measuring velocities of simple objects and all the rest of that, that's great and that's fine. That's, you know, a limited context in which we can achieve very high precision. But what I'm talking about is, I'm getting to talk about art, which is very evidently not subdued to these principles. And that's fine, and probably everyone would agree. So the really exciting thing that I'm trying to construct here is the attitude towards art technology. Okay, because evidently in producing art technology, we can really be well informed by, the conclusions that come from controlled environments. But actually we are working towards things that operate in a totally different way. And this is what I'm trying to tackle, because what I find is that the purpose is still defined according to laboratory paradigm. Okay, so if I say, well, actually, I want this piece of art technology to allow me to paint something that is a kilometer by kilometer, size. And that's it. And then I find a way to do this, and I suddenly have a machine that can make a painting of that size, and there's drones above it, and it's all done. But it doesn't really help the artist as much. Okay, so I'm trying to find ways to use the understanding of how the complex, nonlinear, chaotic systems, I should say, how emerging properties operate, and aid production of that, rather than specify measurable outcomes and produce those tools. Okay, cool. So yeah, that's what I've been talking about. No general purpose. Now, the other thing which I've kind of tackled already is this antagonism, potentially antagonism, but essentially it is, again, a subset superset relationship, because design is a subset of evolution. And we tend to think that by design, we will outsmart the evolution, right? And it's really interesting because now we actually have evolutionary algorithms, we have neural networks, we don't understand how they operate, but they actually solve the kind of things that we really desire to have solved. So hopefully it is becoming more and more evident how design is a subset of evolutionary processes, and actually our human intelligence is the subset of evolutionary intelligence. Whereas obviously the paradigm, which is again this self-inflation of the monkey, tells us that I'm smarter than this piece of rock, I'm smarter than the bird there, and then among the humans, there's people who are supposedly more clever than others. So that's all self-inflation. I mean, that's really obvious in primatology, how that works, how it operates, the increment of one's ranking. So that I think is quite, it is quite well, it is quite useful to bring it into the discussion, because it invites humbleness. Okay, and what I'm actually thinking about most of the time is building systems that suddenly appear miraculous. Okay, so not trying to measure the miracle, and figure out, okay, if it has these measures, then it's a miracle. But actually find ways to engage with the environment, with the tools, with the medium that the artist engages with, and allow this actual direct perception to call it a miracle. Okay, and talking about monkeys and intelligence, I think I'm probably going to stretch it quite a bit, and a lot of stuff that I say is essentially inviting disagreement, right? That's the subversive stance here. But to me, it seems that thinking altogether is what they call a secondary sexual property. No, not property, secondary sexual. There is a term I'm seeking here. Something like property, maybe property. So what I'm getting to is a comparison with other biological forms whereby a certain property procreates because it helps procreation, but actually it is really disadvantaging the monkey. Okay, so with monkeys, typically already you have ones which have ball sacks of the size that impedes their walking. But that size of ball sack actually made, procreated better. Okay, so it is, and I do think that the thinking is a similar thing, because for some reason in mating processes of advanced monkeys, the thinking, kind of progressed, procreated more. But actually, in terms of the basic survival, I don't know if you guys have an issue with this, but the mind doesn't stop thinking. I've actually spent years, decades, and I don't know even if I'm halfway there, to be able to actually dedicate my awareness to perception. It is really tough for me to dedicate my awareness to perception. I mean, coming up with this complex reasoning to do that is a funny configuration to start with, and it does kind of help. So it kind of, the thinking processes can loop back on themselves and kind of make themselves obsolete at a certain point, I guess. I mean, I already think that most of my thinking is useless, and I would rather engage with the perception. So there is a kind of self-defeating potential in this thinking process, which again highlights this idea that it's just not the pinnacle of evolution at all. Okay. Cool. So I think I've pushed it. So agency blur, I kind of talked about agency already. So for me, it's a really interesting thing. I mean, people typically think that, first of all, they're free to do stuff. Second of all, they do stuff for certain reasons. I'm not convinced by this. First of all, I think I have limited agency. I'm not thinking, and my drives are determining what I do. And actually the cognitive processes here are inhibitory more than driving. Okay, and this actually brings me to this maybe one last philosophical thing that I would like to discuss. It is the causality itself. Okay, so to me it seems, again, I'm a bit of an amateur in this domain, but to me it seems that we could actually build up the same complexity of models, physics, all the rest of it, if we took a totally opposite assumption, which is that causality is not pushing from the past, but the forces acting are pulling into the future. Because there's a really crucial symmetry there. And I do think it's only a matter of convention that we are totally convinced that everything is pushing from the past. And in fact, there is one thing which kind of supports this idea. Someone calculated the likelihood of this configuration of matter starting from the Big Bang. So they kind of figured out all the crucial balances where things developed in a certain way rather than another way. And I think the likelihood of this actually being the case from the Big Bang was something like 10 to the power minus 40. The smallest probability you could ever get to, pretty much. So this paradigm, the science that we live by, actually defeats itself. It's saying that it's totally unlikely that this happens. Whereas we could, instead of computing likelihood in terms of past to future, we could also attempt to produce models which compute inevitability, which actually starts right now, because this, if anything, this right now is totally inevitable. So there's nothing that I can be more certain than the fact that this, what is currently the case, is inevitable, and compute from there. So then the whole idea of investigating past is actually a pull to the future. And then it sounds a bit more mystical probably, but the fact that there is such thing as awareness, and me trying to complete a sentence, trying to get to the end of the talk, trying to do many things, is a kind of pull to the future as well. Okay, so that's this other idea that I'm engaged with in this sense. So yeah, conventional. Why do I call it conventional uncomputing? Let me just try to kind of summarize this chapter. Well, I call it conventional because what could be unconventional? So it's a kind of a, you know, it's this rebellious sense of, okay, I'm going to subvert stuff, therefore I am out of the system, and therefore I am unconventional. But actually the definition of the system is such that everything is included in the postmodern situation. Okay, and in fact, part of this argumentation goes into blurring these distinctions. Part of it goes into tackling the unnecessary extrapolation. What do you mean, system as a whole? 5 apples in a basket makes sense. All of the apples in the basket make sense. But all of the stars in the universe, why would that make sense? I mean, first of all, sense making is a neurological phenomenon. It's a subset of reality. It may very well reflect a lot of it, but why would it ever embrace it? It really puzzles me. I mean, it doesn't puzzle me because it's self-inflation of monkeys that drives us, the sense of increasing our ranking. Okay, so that's the idea of actually it cannot be unconventional because it's all by the same evolutionary convention, and uncomputing because it's not supposed to take us anywhere. It's not supposed to, first of all, truncate stuff, then define goals based on this truncation, and then further truncate to verify whether the goal is achieved. Okay, so what I'm really looking at is much more fluent systems, systems that actually evolve as they are. So kind of going away from the fixed representation as well, because even if maybe some of the stuff that I've presented here is, you know, tackled by a bit more, you know, a bit stronger experts in the field, and it becomes a chapter, it becomes a book, like unconventional computing probably started as a very small thing somewhere and suddenly it latches on. So what I'm trying to say is that this fixed representation is also this kind of self-defeating thing, or I should say the idea that I'm proposing different representations which are not fixed is a contradiction, right? So, and that's the funny thing. So, and that's the self-defeating characteristic of all this activity. And to me, that is the kind of the verifiable achievement, the fact that it has actually made itself obsolete. And I have a similar opinion about politics. So once the politics really advances to where it can go, it becomes totally obsolete because there is no political decisions to make. It's an adaptive system which adapts to itself. And I do think that the adaptation, the kind of internal adaptation to itself, is the superset of the human intelligence, which is the subset of the intelligence that is purely self-adaptation. And we kind of see it in neural networks as well, right? So there is no agency, there is no cleverness, there is nothing mystically, you know, different. There is no emerging phenomenon. There is no jumping the next level. It just is horribly adaptive internally. And what it does, it shows us that all you need is essentially very stupid cells, and you need very dense interconnection, and you need a recursive thing. around it. You need a feedback around it, and it already does its thing. So I do think that decline in cognitive ability, which seems to be obvious in our culture. I mean, just looking at the levels, you know, that people achieve in terms of, you know, understanding computation, maths, you know, logic, all these things. It's just downhill all the way. But the interconnectedness of people is really growing. And I do think that that actually pushes the collective intelligence, the collective adaptability. I mean, the kind of reaction that we have currently on a global scale is tremendous. I think at this stage, if all the governments of the world said, well, actually now we have a variant which is 1,000,000 times worse, you have to stay locked in and all the food will be delivered to your door and you may not exit. I think in an instant, the whole, you know, the whole race, all the people will change the behavior. This is the degree of adaptability that is unprecedented. So I think that the collective intelligence is crucially advanced through decreasing individual intelligence. And there is no awareness that has to guide this. It is just what it is. It is horribly adaptive. And then the way we as humans kind of, you know, poetically or emotionally get attached to the idea that there is the I, that there is the agency in me, I'm not sure. I mean, most of the behavior, there is reflection and there is seemingly an intervention from the level, which is reflection, to lower organizational levels. But to me, it seems it's negligible. I mean, I think I can intervene, you know, maybe a few times a week. In fact, there is good evidence that behavior is a fairly autonomous entity in humans. I mean, evidently people are struggling to stop certain behaviors, right? So there is no such thing as I control my behavior. It's actually a source of struggle. There is no direct control there. And what I would propose is that the thought is also fairly autonomous. In fact, if I stop this right now and I think, okay, what would Tom Mitchell think about this, right? Then immediately I have a thought that jumps into my mind, and I don't have to devote attention to developing that thought. Okay, so it is questionable whether this occurrence of me thinking supposedly what someone else would think, that this necessitates agency. No, I think it's fairly automatic. I just immediately know what my mom would think about this. Okay, so I'm really questioning the amount of agency we have with thinking processes as well. Okay, so maybe that's plenty for that chapter. Let's go on. I think I'm probably just gonna go on. I mean, everyone who needs a break, hell yeah, you know how it goes. So I'll just push it while I last, and then that will be it. Okay, so I'm gonna try to narrow this discussion to art. So first of all, some of the things that I would like to deeply question is the idea of communication, messaging, signals, the kind of thing, okay, art is, you know, I'm expressing myself, you know, it's all about communication. I think these terms presuppose isolation. I just don't find it very feasible to consider that my mind is isolated from everyone else's, that I am, you know, in a bag of skin and I'm free to do what's possible to do. I mean, my drives to start with are evolutionarily determined, totally. My inhibitions that kind of modulate these drives are culturally determined. So the degree of agency that I have is really small. And then what I also find is that in communicating, actually the only thing that happens is that the available thoughts are shined light onto during something that we could call communication. So it's a bit more like resonance. So if a thought can resonate, if it can produce a sense of meaning, okay? So first of all, meaning, no meaning beyond neurological activity, I would say. So something that produces a sense of meaning has to do with the fact that the entity that produced this sense of meaning is a very similar entity. There is a good amount of resonance there. And it's very evident, you know, in terms of languages, I mean, in terms of music, in terms of arts. Maybe that's the domain where it's most evident. You know, what does it take to think that, toilet furniture in gallery is art? A pissoir. Well, what's the English word? I think urinal, yeah? So it actually takes a very specific kind of resonance. It takes, you know, decades of going to art galleries and starting to feel like nothing's really interesting in this place anymore. And then suddenly the thing that was never supposed to be there exposed is the only interesting thing left. Okay, so this meaning, and actually, again, I've actually meant to look this up. It's one of the Lakoff's chapters in one of his early books, I think, the Metaphors We Live By. He's actually he started as a linguist, as the main opponent of Chomsky, who has the idea that, you know, the structure is superior and there is the grammar, and then things are, you know, configured, things exist because they fit in the structure, which I think is the wrong way around. You know, first the language is an evolutionary outcome and we use it and we can, you know, discuss how to, you know, kill a deer for dinner or whatever as advanced monkeys running around. And then much later at some point, someone's like, oh, there seems to be a regularity. And this idea of regularity is a really nice one, but the slightly less nice idea is the idea of law. So the fact that we still call things law of physics, concepts, laws of physics, is really mind-boggling, because it's actually a term that comes from political organization. Law, what do you mean law? How would you know? We have a very small window of observation in terms of what we think we can conceive of in terms of extrapolating in future and past. So regularities of physics, of nature, is probably a better term. And that's a fairly safe concept, I think. You can observe a certain degree of regularity. But to call something a law, self-inflation, advanced monkeys increasing their rank. I'm sorry, but I can't think of a better way of tackling why on earth would someone think that there is such thing as law of nature. And that's where this whole Lakoffian, if that becomes a term, I think it should become a term. What Lakoff has done, if you ask me, is he's attended this feast of science, and everyone is munching away and they're loving it. And he's just taken the tablecloth and he's pulled it all out, and the whole feast is still in place. And everyone is still munching away as if nothing has happened. But actually, the whole paradigm has just changed because so many things are explained through basic neurological activities, including the making of the assumption that there is something beyond the neurological activity in terms of what we perceive and explore as universe. Even that is explained through this paradigm. So I do think that, you know, this thing is about to hit, but nevertheless, the whole feast should stay just the way it is, because the bridges won't collapse, right? Just because it seems that, you know, the underlying paradigm is not as good as it can get. So interesting stuff there. Now, in terms of signals, messaging, commutation, arts, unconventional stuff, I mean, there is a whole lot of hype there, right? So, you know, when I read stuff like trees are communicating with roots, I mean, how would you define communication? Obviously, there's probably different ways of doing this, but I would say that the potential to lie is definitely one of the things that belongs to communication and does not belong to signals. Okay, so if I'm sweating, right, I cannot lie with my sweat. That's a signal to the environment. And then the dogs may actually be aware of my emotional state. Other humans probably perceive my emotional state through these pheromones, but are not aware of it because evolutionarily it wasn't as crucial in the way we organized. So I would like to make a clear distinction here that, you know, there's a whole lot of signals that provide this interaction between entities, but I would not call it communication, because you cannot conceive of a message. You cannot in that domain, right? So it is unlikely that, you know, even if a tree, when it's stressed, it produces a very specific signal with its roots, which is picked up by other trees, which respond to that. There's very little ground to claim that there is some kind of awareness there, some kind of intent in communicating and all the rest. And in fact, I would like to, you know, propose that arts are indeed signals and not communication devices. I mean, I can probably talk most about music, and to me it seems that it's the primordial sonic utterance which typically cannot lie. It can exaggerate, it can modulate the content, so to speak, but even that idea of content, I think, is something to tackle. But in any case, I can push it. I can push an emotion. You know, if I feel really sad, I can actually push myself further. I can go back from it. But the kind of idea, lying, denial, doesn't really work with art. Okay, so to me it seems that, you know, it comes before communication, and therefore it is a deeper domain like that. And therefore measuring it, therefore truncating it, doesn't really do much service. So the question arises, does truncating the tools that allow for art to be made, does truncating those tools make too much sense? I mean, evidently, most of the tools are developed with this approach, and there's nothing wrong. In fact, there's nothing to compare to, so we can't really evaluate that. But in any case, what we can, you know, think about is how do we develop tools that go beyond that? Okay, so the tools that actually provide, that grow themselves. Okay, so this adaptive growth is the superset, it seems to me, of our intelligence, right? So to come up with ways of, you know, producing tools for art that have this property, that are actually adaptively growing rather than fixed based on truncating phenomena. Okay, so yeah, and then in terms of challenge as well, grow a logical clause. Can we create a system that grows a logical clause? Happened already. The logical clause has grown from the environment, is the evolutionary outcome. Okay, so actually in the way we produce technology that mimics what is grown already is part of the exact same growing process. So I'm back with this idea of blurring these distinctions, because making these distinctions is, well, it's confining the options, really. It's confining the, I mean, it's a really interesting topic, because in a way, the combinatorial thinking does not have to be in conflict with intuition. It's part of the intuition that grows the intuition. Okay, so this is what I've discovered early on playing with electronic tools, in fact, analog modular studios, is that, you know, initially, oh my God, look at those 200 patch holes, bloody hell. Wow, I can do everything. I can make unheard of things. And very soon, or maybe not too soon, I've realized that intuitive exploration is much more limited than systemic exploration. But building a system for exploration is part of that intuition. So again, it's a superset subset relationship rather than things being on par and choosing between them. Okay, so that's why I think it's really useful to consider this, because all the thinking has to be intuitive by definition, because it's a subset of this drive, the subset of this needs to be done. Without the limbical push for something to get done, there is no thinking. So all the attempts to defeat the limbical drives with thinking, well, it just creates a lot of internal friction. And then the biggest question is whether these frictions are actually antagonisms, or are they very peculiar balances? Which brings us to the idea that it is what you think it is. You can think that, you know, I've evidenced recently a cat torturing a bird, tearing out all its feathers. The poor thing was, you know, bones sticking out, horrible stuff. And then you don't know what to do with the bird. You can't really kill it. I mean, you could try to drown it. And then we talked amongst, you know, friends, and I was like, yeah, well, I kind of thought I could drown a bird. I mean, I have no clue. But in any case, we kind of left it to die because it was in the state of no repair. And then, you know, from an emotional, empathetic point of view, it's a horrible antagonism. I mean, how could you, you know, and of all things, why would such a behavior evolve? You know, it's not eating it. But actually, what I'm trying to say is that this can be considered a very peculiar balance just as well. Okay, so it is definitely what we think it is. That's my idea. Okay, so thinking further about, okay, how do we include these considerations into, you know, designing conventional uncomputation, designing unconventional computation, or indeed the title of it all, the unconventional audio signal processing. Well, adaptive growth, you know, can we make systems that actually adapt and grow by themselves without this truncation-based intervention? You know, whatever, I made an instrument. Oh, well, the dynamics aren't too loud because the loud things don't sound too intense. Can I increase this? Right, so we have a way in developing these technologies, a method which jumps out of the interaction, analyzes it, computes, blah, blah, blah. This should be the desired outcome, produces a variant, throws it back in, and then, you know, kind of keeps jumping in and out. Can we come up with stuff that does not necessitate this jumping in and out, that the system actually evolves as you use it, that it selects for the better or the desired outcome automatically, just because it's part of everything. It's part of evolution. It's part of how everything functions all together. Okay, and one concept that relates to that idea is the one of unpronounced functionality. And I do find that most amazing artists, first of all, cannot explain why, how. None of this really produces descriptions that are worthwhile. And some of them are saying, well, you shouldn't even try, right? To some of them, it's evident that, you know, trying to truncate this domain just doesn't really do much. It just does it. It happens. It's an environment which is sufficiently adaptive internally to develop, and there is a sense of wholesomeness. There is a sense of, yes, this is actually it. And again, it is a sense of, right? So the truth is a neurological phenomenon. You can build up many logics. Every axiomatic system will have strings which are unverifiable, done with, right? So it is about, okay, is it a miracle? And that's a neurological phenomenon, and that's the only thing that there is. So in fact, part of the uncomputing idea is I don't have to go anywhere from where I currently am. This is already a total miracle. How on earth am I talking to, you know, non-present things? The ideas that I have are not really mine. They resonate, they trigger. If at any point in life, a human actually broadens the perspective and looks at what the hell is going on, it's a total miracle in every possible moment. Okay, so what I find is that the artists are crucially the people who can play with this sense and can actually focus it. And I'm like, okay, I have a floor tom here. Okay, so I have to find the miracle which is confined in this floor tom. And then I can do that, and then I know, well, floor tom is handy because I can record it with a single good microphone quite well, maybe two, whatever. And then I have a sense that I can actually confine the miracle of everything and, you know, send it as a file to someone else who may listen to it and really get a sense of miracle. But if one is sufficiently sensitive and untroubled and sufficiently lacks a sense of having to do stuff, having to go places, having to achieve goals, then all of this is immediately available in any possible domain. Because it's just this neurological thing, it's a miracle. And I would argue that there is nothing higher value than that. I mean, including, you know, someone coming up with the law of thermodynamics, and it's like, oh my God, look at the measurement, look at the pressure, look at the temperature. It's a miracle. Of course it is, right? So the only funny thing is, the only anomaly is when someone thinks that something is not a miracle. That's the anomaly, because the complexity of stuff, the amount of reflection that the human can have onto the whole of the universe, it's just done with already. I really don't see why are we striving for things. I correct myself. I do see it's called increasing the ranking. It's just a basic limbic drive, and it's a miraculous one as well. So it's all in there. Cool. So hopefully back to music tech a bit. And designing, thinking about unconventionality in essentially aiding arts. I mean, I've kind of completed the whole the whole monologue here, because I said, well, actually, there is nothing to strive for because it's already quite good. So I might as well stop here. But let me increase my ranking a bit further, okay? If anyone is still interested, as I've announced, this might take more than an hour, 2 hours. I hope to be done by 6. We'll see. In any case, it should be documented and available for later appreciation. So what I was talking about can also be described in terms of manipulation for its own sake, play. Okay, so actually the purposefulness is the subset of play. Okay, this is my claim. It's when a child realizes that everyone seems to be playing this game of achieving stuff. Let's do it, because then we are all cozier together, right? And then at some point, this becomes so entrenched that we can't leave it anymore. There has to be a purpose to stuff we do, otherwise it's a disaster. Otherwise it's the only thing that there is. But actually, if you take a bit of a psychoanalytical approach there, it seems that fear of loss has everything to do with the lack of engagement. The only thing I fear losing is the thing that I was supposed to have experienced but never managed to. If I fully experience something, if I can actually stop doing this and perceive instead, there's nothing to lose. There is no way of this sense of loss arising altogether, because the complexity of the stuff that I can perceive fully occupies the mind. In fact, the mind cannot perceive everything because the amount of occupation it would have to bear would self-destroy it. I don't know, that's obviously, now I'm getting poetic. But you see what I'm saying, that the idea of achievement is a subset of play, because the play is this evolutionary stage, right? So I kind of link it to crooked mapping. Okay, so in developing awareness of adaptive processes, which seems to be the development of humans, what seems to happen is that actually it comes from some, it's inspired by some science. There have been experiments with rats and mazes, mice and mazes, poor mice, totally, the amount of mice that are being procreated intentionally just to harm them is huge. And now that they can run around with neurological needles in them and, you know, kind of real-time project the brain activity onto people's screens, it's really exploding as well. So in any case, there is this needle which has 80 electrodes, and they can actually, you know, kind of pick out different neurons pretty much, or at least very well map a brain region. They have found, you know, where to stick it in order to plot the understanding of position in an environment of a mouse. So pretty much they can plot the maze on the screen from the neurological signals while the rat is in the maze, which is funny. And the really interesting thing to me is that while the rat is running around the maze, that is verifiable on the plot, that he knows where he is. But once the mice stops running in the maze, then the signal of awareness within the maze starts to run much faster. So it's actually traversing the maze at a crazy speed while it's static, whereas the speed is matching when it is actually going through the maze. Okay, so the ability, the neurological phenomenon of mapping the environment, very complex environment, is evident. You know, many simple organisms can, you know, find spots back again. They can attach certain sensation. There is the food, there is the danger. All of this works very likely without any awareness or agency. It's a kind of an automatic response to the environment, but it actually maps the environment with great detail. And then the ability to traverse these maps without engaging with the environment arises. And then the ability to mess it up and to use a totally different map on a totally different environmental situation arises. And that seems to be the core of play. Because this is a ship that is sailing the sea, and this is the main pirate in there, and he's very happy because the sea, and he's eating a lot of good fish. Okay, so I'm actually taking a map and just smashing it onto a different situation, and it excites me. It has this neurological, sensation which makes me do that. If you observe kids, they do this constantly. It's the only thing that makes any sense. So suddenly the mapping of the environment, traversing through this map, the establishing of the map through being still and thinking about it, kind of recomputing the map, is fine, is done with. But now we can actually mess it all up. We can mess these maps up. And we have a sense of agency in this messing up activity. I think that is the main ability of which science is a subset. I'll just leave that right there. Okay, so I'm hopefully about to wrap up this chapter. In terms of, arts, how the technology may develop to essentially, a different paradigm. How can we replace, how could we pull the tablecloth underneath the feast is evidently how I describe a paradigm change. And it's evidently pretty much the only thing that really excites me. So yeah, I mean, yeah, so I'll just introduce this one last thing that again, seems to be a funny syntax, which is abuser friendly. Because evidently we are stormed with stuff which is supposedly user friendly. And that's one of the things in terms of digital tools that artists use and certain artists produce and certain people produce for artists are, in my view, limiting. Now, as far as the art goes, as far as the sense of miracle invoking that sense in any possible situation goes, of course, therefore it doesn't really matter how much you limit anyone. A good artist will exactly be able to produce a play, a really worthwhile expression, configuration in relation to those limitations. Okay, so, but aside of that, which kind of defeats this whole talk and, producing a paper out of this and blah, blah, all the rest, I still am interested in thinking about what could be the ways to ease these limitations, okay, no matter the fact that they're very useful and that the usefulness is useless altogether. So, and this leads me to the abuser-friendly idea and the fact that this floor tom, I won't go into it now. I have a jigsaw as well and a drill, and I can abuse it totally. It is actually abuser-friendly. And you may find that some people will consider this a very artistic expression. To me, well, let's not get into my aesthetic position here. Let's get to the object, to the tool of art making. So it's totally abuser friendly. Now, a user friendly this fader box is not abuser friendly because I can kind of treat it the way I treat the floor tom, and I could drill it and do nasty things to it, but it suddenly breaks down. Suddenly, all of its functionality, which has to do with controlling, other devices, just instantly breaks down. And the way I imagine treating it, it's probably irreversible as well. And this is typically the property of digital stuff. because they are designed, and this design presupposes the kind of usage that it promotes, and there is no real way of, you know, pushing the limit. I mean, very clever, you know, people, there is things like circuit bending and all of this, but actually that's also more analog electronics, and analog electronics are more abuser friendly than digital electronics. So evidently, you know, I'm not just saying delineating these things and saying, well, actually, if you can abuse it, it's potentially more artistic. And if you can use it, then it's potentially more marketable. What I'm trying to develop here is ideas that allow for digital things to actually include these properties. So very specifically, I made a few plugins like this. So the idea is that if you have a range that you control digitally, that you just plain build in, you know, first 5%, the last 5%, build in totally unexpected nonlinear behavior into that region. Okay, because evidently if I physically push it beyond, you know, the distance it's supposed to travel, then it breaks down and it doesn't work anymore. Similarly, you know, if I'm live coding and I push it because I put in 3 parentheses, it breaks down immediately and doesn't work. So the way we can push these digital tools is just not very artistic. It is more kind of, you know, tuning, preciseness. So I am given the domain, and within that domain, I am being very careful, craftful, even artistic. All of this is very well. But what I'm trying to promote is actually having both available. Okay, so kind of finding ways where you have tools that allow you to produce preciseness, to produce craft in a very detailed fashion, but also account for the potential desire to break the rules, to get out of the paradigm, to drop out. And in thinking about this dropping out, you know, it's a metaphor, drop out. And drop, right? It kind of carries a negative connotation, unless it's you know, it's an aesthetic of self-defeat and self-victimization. All the aesthetics are very you know, welcome as far as I'm concerned. I mean, if an aesthetic position troubles someone, it means that they're really attracted to it. If I don't resonate with an aesthetic position, if it leaves me indifferent, that means that I don't resonate. But if I'm angry at it, it means I totally resonate, right? So there is no way of escaping that, I would think. Okay. So what I'm saying is, you know, try to design. Obviously, I promote this in terms of tools for arts, systems which have this built-in unpredictability. And to build in unpredictability, I mean, I'll get a little bit into the way I describe chaos in simplest possible terms, is that all you need is 3 things, right? So here I'm actually referring to the logistic map. So I need a growth factor, I need an inverting nonlinearity, and I need a feedback loop. I need a recursion around those 2. So if I have those 2, I already have the potential for a stable orbit, I have a potential for an oscillating orbit, and I have the potential for chaos. And I think this principle is crucially feasible to implement into what is at this current stage just a limited domain of intervention. Okay, so maybe I should leave it there, because I do think that these three components, if they can be built into the behavior of digital systems, then we're getting to this idea of, okay, we're allowing the system to explode and we are making sure that it can meaningfully explode. And we are making sure that after the explosion, it is reversible. So I can actually tame the growth factor and get back to a controllable situation, which actually goes beyond this initial idea that I proposed. So if I have a 5% here and 5% there chaos, then it's still confined and controlled. So it doesn't fully embrace the principle of having a system that can altogether blow up and do unexpected things, right? So if these three principles are implemented in a better way, then the whole fader is blowing up, not just the extremities. Okay? Cool. Okay, I'm wrapping up this chapter. Chapter 2 done with. Now, I'll try to go through the rest of this a bit quicker. Huh. Don't take my word on that. But definitely chapter 3 is going to be a short one, because it really goes into practicalities. And as I said, my current attempt is all about opening the perspectives, wishful thinking, what if, could we not? So I have many more questions than solutions. And personally, I have to explore all the myriad of substrates and media that transmit signals to a much larger extent. And the funny thing is that the pieces to this puzzle are there, but they're totally spread out. So in the Unconventional Computing book edited by Andy, the chapter on analog computation actually does not go into the stuff that analog synthesizers are best for. I mean, just briefly about this, I mean, probably because it's uncomputation, right? So I'll briefly describe what I do with analog synths. I have a matrix mixer, which is 4 inputs, 4 outputs. And I have growth factors. So this is ability to create complex feedback loops. I have growth factors, which means devices that would amplify the signal, devices that would amplify a certain spectral region of the signal, resonating filters and so forth. And I have inverting nonlinearities, things we call folders. Otherwise, you can actually use nonlinearities which don't invert. You can induce chaos with that as well. But in inverting nonlinearities, you're better bet. And I just know that these are the 3 principles that I need. And I am totally positive that this can produce totally unheard of sounds, stuff I would never expect. So actually I totally uncompute. I keep my ability to recognize a miracle. First of all, the ability to not recognize a miracle, to consider something not miraculous, because that's the first thing, you have to deny it. And once I deny it, then I can focus this into narrower bounds and make sure that this miracle arises within those very narrow bounds. Okay, so that's what I do. I do a lot of feedback loops with growth and with inversion, and the chaos arises. And because that's that, it just happens. And the kind of sounds that come out never resemble, all digital chaos that I've messed with quite a bit as well. It's just a totally unique universe on its own. So you see that area, and actually there is more and more research happening in this area. People are actually figuring out, okay, different filter topologies, how do they escape to chaos? What happens with this? What happens with that? But then again, the analog computing history of it all doesn't really relate to that. And that's the most exciting thing, that all of these things are so spread out. And the other thing that I've been doing, published some of this, is with transmission through biological tissue, through leaves, aloe vera leaves. So what happens there is that I find nonlinearity. I actually find spectral characteristic, kind of bandpass characteristic. I find something which I haven't quite tackled yet, which is this idea of simplifying the phase space, which seems to be what coils are doing anyway, and transformers in analog gear, because everything you do to an analog signal, which is high fidelity, almost by necessity decreases the fidelity technically, but perceptually it may actually increase it. Okay, so that's the thing where the psychoacoustics and the technical understanding of the signals seem to contradict. So in that type of research, I've also found that, you know, okay, I'm here, I have an aloe vera leaf, I find these things which may be useful for audio signals, but it's totally difficult to find someone who is a chemist, who is not building on top of the pyramid, but actually can tell me, okay, the ions that are carrying most of the electricity have, you know, that amount of resistance in this gel type medium, and therefore their speed, this, that, you know, it's horribly difficult to find a chemist who could actually tackle and start to explain certain properties that I just plain measure. Okay, so that's why these fields are so exciting, because all of the understanding is pretty much there to really progress, but it's so difficult to grab hold of. So I've kind of tackled here, I'm tackling this signal transmission substrates. It's part of the stuff that's going on. I mean, actually the hype is all around, can we listen to the life that resides in a biological entity? I hear the rose. So I find there's a whole lot of poetry in the domain of sonification. And I love poetry exactly because it's poetry. But in terms of delineating and analyzing these things, I would call most of it arbitrary mapping. Okay, so taking data from one domain, truncating a domain, measuring the domain, taking the numbers, sticking those numbers into another domain is arbitrary mapping. Nothing wrong with that. It can be very beautiful in terms of the outcome. It can be very poetic because I'm listening to the smell of the rose. Great, whole lot of poetry. But in terms of actually translating between domains, it's a total failure. There is, so, and actually this was fairly well established, I think, already in the 80s when people have started thinking a bit more about these interactive systems, and the term that really covers the next level from the kind of the poetic arbitrary mapping is conceptual mapping. So the extent to which the source domain can be analyzed to provide a conceptual configuration, and the extent to which the target domain can work with this concept makes the sonification an actual translation between the domains. Okay, and one of the really good ways of testing whether, you know, in the sonification implementation, whether it's you know, arbitrary poetic mapping or whether it's actual translation between domains, is replace the source, right? So if I'm saying, okay, I'm gonna listen to the smell of the rose, and I've spent some time building a complex mapping which produces a really exciting, lovely sounds, well, then I would have to take a, a yellow rose instead of the red rose. Or I would take, I've recently engaged with orange tree flower, which smells beautiful. And then the question is, well, will the outcome sound very similar, or will it actually produce a very different character? Okay, so replacing the sources really tackles it in most of the sonification systems can be very well analyzed by doing this. And then most of all, you know, stick in random numbers. Take the data that was extracted from the smell of the rose, do a very basic statistical distribution analysis, throw you know, white noise through that filter. I think it's very unlikely that the outcome will be significantly different from the rose, and it's actually just a bunch of numbers which are similar to what we got out of the rose. So what I'm trying to do here is obviously have some fun and increase my ranking, but most of all promote this deeper investigation into this translation between domains in the domain of sonification. So I kind of went on a tangent there while talking about this basic signal transmission. I mean, you see, this is already back to the computing. As soon as I call something a signal, it is truncating that domain. And in fact, I have prepared something. So brace, this might go on for 3 hours. I'm sorry, people, maybe you're still with me. I have another thing here, which shows the arbitrariness or indeed the potential of designing your own truncation, okay? Because actually, if we leave the truncation on the side, we might just stop doing stuff altogether, which is fine, which is the best outcome. But while we are still increasing our ranking, let's do it well. So what I have done here is I've taken the melody of Happy Birthday to You. And by the way, there's many different transcriptions of this melody in different meters. And when I've done this, I have no clue which one I've used, but this seems to be it because I kind of remember it in 3, 4, but although when I play it on an accordion, I always play it in 5 and whatnot. But what I'll try to show here is that in music, it is very clear that that the truncation, which is the intuitive basic truncation principle that we have, is just not very useful in many ways. Okay, so what we have in terms of, you know, melodies, well, first of all, truncating a melody. So melody, evolutionarily, I think it's a limbic utterance. It's the kind of utterance that you can exaggerate, but you cannot lie about. And I think it preserves this character even in the age where we produce a lot of false claims. And once there was the truncation came about, which means, okay, the melody consists of distinct pitches, which come to exist at certain points in time. This truncation has totally redefined what melody is. So actually in these days, it is, you know, everyone, if you say melody, well, this is what they think of. They think of some kind of time arranged pitch structure. And therefore, if I ask a composer, could you please make, you know, here's 100 quid, you know, give me a lovely lullaby, they're going to start doing this. Whereas, especially lullabies, I mean, truncated pitches in time and frequency, I mean, hell no. So it's really interesting how, and that shows this whole process, which all of the, science induces in terms of changing the way we think about stuff and changing the way we do stuff altogether. Okay, I think this is a very good domain to explore this, because it's evident that, a melody, a limbic utterance, which is pure and direct the way it is, once it's truncated, it becomes a totally different thing, and it actually self-destructs. It actually, defeats those inherent properties of what they used to be. Okay, so now in terms of truncation, let's do it. I'm not saying let's not do it. I'm saying let's do it, but let's reflect on it. Let's be aware of what's happening as we do it. And let's try to find alternative ways of truncating things, okay? So this is evidently the kind of truncation that, and in fact, I have no clue whether the composer used the piano, which is already a truncated in time, in pitch type of instrument. But the point is that even within this truncation of time and pitch, I can come up with different models of organizing these events that are much more useful. Okay, so what I'm getting to here is, oh, and finally I had a blank paper here. It's totally dead. Oh, there it is. I didn't use it much, but here we go. So what I'm getting to here is a concept of indispensability, which was introduced to me and supposedly also invented by this amazing person called Clarence Barlow. And he's the kind of mathematician who produced an equation which gives you the indispensability of rhythm and pitch altogether. But, and it's the kind of equation, it has the product P and other symbols that I never seen before and have no clue what they mean. But I do understand that he's able to mathematically formulate the kind of cyclic nature of how the indispensability seems to work out. So let's get to the basics here. So what is indispensability? Well, it actually tells us how indispensable something is, how necessary it is. And if I have a 3/4 meter, okay, I'm in music now, then these notes have a different degree of indispensability in relation to maintaining the structural property. Okay, so if I want to maintain the sense of this meter, the most crucial thing is that I play the first note. Okay, and then the question which one of the other two are more indispensable, you can think of this just by trying it out. So if I go, if this is a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, if I go tus, tu, tus, tu, tus, the question is whether that rhythm highlights the structure better than the following 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, tu, tuts, tu, tuts, tu, tuts. And to me, it seems, and probably many would agree, that this third note is more indispensable in terms of maintaining that metric structure. And then this one is left with the value 1. So I don't really look into the equation, Clarence's equation of indispensability, but I look into this principle of highlighting the importance of an element in relation to maintaining the structure. Okay, so, and then what you can do, obviously, is you can derive that. So if I have eighth notes there, okay, so I can actually expand on this. And what I can do there, well, the first one is typically the most indispensable. I mean, evidently, if the structure is established, in music, we can omit the first strike, impact, whatever, but we're not talking about the situation when things are established and we're trying to counteract them to provide some contrast, but about establishing the structure, okay? So it's not going beyond that. Okay, so in that sense, I could say, well, actually, in terms of maintaining the structure, this could be, well, actually, I shouldn't use 3s and 2s anymore. I should instead do 6, right? Because 6 is the maximum number here. The most indispensable one is this. And then I could think of, okay, how do I derive this? Well, I would think that this is number 5. So if I just play these rhythms out, if I have this leading note, that the last one is the leading note, is a very important. It doesn't really highlight the 3/4 feel. You know, it's the last one. It's kind of comes really close before the 6, the first beat. So it's not crucial in establishing that structure. And in doing this, in creating these indispensability maps, typically this leading note principle is the one that I adhere to. So if you have one note after the main beat and one before, the one that is leading the one before is typically more able to highlight that structure. And then in terms of you know, maintaining the 3/4 feel, I would say that this is the next one down the line. And then the questions becomes, okay, so what is the next one? Well, to me, it seems that the very last note would be that, because it's the leading principle. So that's something like that. And then actually what seems to occur in the way I make my indispensability maps is that immediately after the most important beat comes the least important one, because the most important beat becomes even more important if there's nothing following it, because it kind of establishes itself in a larger space. Okay, so that's this idea of indispensability in terms of rhythm. Now, what I'm getting to here is the idea that temporal proximity is not the best way of truncating rhythm, because the distance between these two first notes is a temporal distance, but perceptually it doesn't really work out that way, because the rhythm, the way we perceive rhythm, has everything to do with establishing a framework, establishing an expectation, and that is a cyclic expectation. So there is a certain cyclic property in this domain that the linear arrangement does not highlight. Okay? So in a way, it seems that these two notes are nearer each other than those two notes, the first two notes. Okay, and I can probably come up with certain experiments where, you know, modulating these two in a similar fashion and the second note in a different fashion appears more musical or coherent than modulating the first two in the same fashion. I didn't quite work this out, how to actually come to a clearer evidence that the temporal proximity is not the musical proximity for rhythm. Okay, and then evidently there is a hierarchy of things as well, right? So if I have a bar and another bar, these two entities correlate much more than something that would be temporally nearer. Okay. Okay, so that's this indispensability principle, which you can actually also do with pitch. Okay, so if you take a C and then you take a G, these are very near in terms of consonance, in terms of musicality. If I take a C and a C sharp, these are very near in terms of frequency, fundamental frequency, but musically they're rather dissonant and they're not as near each other. Okay, so again, the frequency-based delineation of pitches is probably not the best description of the domain, it probably is the most practical and the first thing you do, after, we've invented geometry. It kind of comes natural, but it isn't necessarily that. Okay, and then there is another way of, so I could do this kind of proximity assessment by hand, kind of manually, but I can also use the circle of fifths, which lends itself to do something similar. So actually the proximity of pitches on the circle of fifths tells us more about the consonant relationship between them compared to the chromatic distance. And then there is another thing as well, because I have the chromatic distance, but I can also have the diatonic distance. So if I have a diatonic scale, C, D, E, F, G, keep it in C major, right? Then it is clear that the C, D is nearer, C is nearer to D on a diatonic scale, because actually the C sharp is not even in the scale. Okay, so, and what I'm trying to highlight here is that there's multiple ways of dealing with an already truncated domain if we have to truncate it. Cool, so what I have then is I've developed briefly a different way of expressing this melody. So I've actually looked at, I didn't go through all the details whether it actually matches this transcription, but what I realized is that in my transcription, I have 9 bars and this actually has 10 bars, but that's because I've actually done these 2 bars in a single one, because there's a fairly long rest here. And in the way I sing happy birthday to you, there is not a full bar rest between these 2 things. But it is actually pretty much this melody, and I'm notating it in this way. Okay, so what I have then is a mapping from a metric value based on the indispensability of that metric value to the indispensability of the pitch value. Okay, so what this does is, if the numbers are high, both numbers, it means that it's on a very prominent beat, and it is a very prominent pitch. It is a very indispensable metric value and very indispensable pitch value in order to establish the structure. So you see, from this perspective, suddenly I have a way of describing melodies such that I can see which parts of it are establishing the structure, which is quite crucial to start any musical utterance with, unless it fully relies on an existing tradition, which everyone knows of, like making remixes, which is probably the most fun I ever had in my life. And it allows you to see actually how at some point in this melody, we get a lot of indispensability. So we actually get very dispensable, very dissonant pitches, and also quite unnatural, if I can use that word, metric positions. Okay, and you also actually see the cadence in there, how it actually comes back to a really high value. Both are very high in order to re-establish the structure. So you actually see how it goes away from establishing a structure, because once it's established, it can produce a contrast, and then goes back again. And then obviously I could produce this type of graph with the product of these 2 values and the sum across the bar, which would give me the exact way that this melody is establishing a structure, opposing it, and having a cadence. So it just goes to highlight how, taking stuff for granted is fine, but it doesn't increase your ranking as much, I would hope. Okay, so, and in addition to this, I have to say that all of these pitch indispensabilities are actually relating to the same key, to the tonic key of this melody. And this system can be made even more detailed and probably useful if the harmonic structure is encoded as a third domain. And then the pitch structure, well, not a third, it actually becomes a super domain of the pitch structure, because the indispensability of the pitch depends on the key that is prominent at the given moment. And then again, it is interesting because in order to have that effect musically, we first need to establish that harmonic progression. Okay, and it's actually quite interesting how, you know, in jazz music, how they really challenge everyone who is not a jazz player, because they can internally establish that structure extremely well, and they challenge each other by playing stuff that sounds totally unrelated. But if you listen to it from this perspective, from that harmonic cycle, then it has a totally different appearance, right? Which is the same thing as in linguistics. I've just realized that asking people what a certain word means takes some cognitive processing, but asking them by uttering the whole sentence makes it much quicker. Okay, so if we have a single element on its own, it is very fragile and it doesn't really bear meaning. It only bears meaning in the given context. Okay, cool. So yeah, how did I get there? So in essence, transmission substrates, interesting stuff. Obviously sound is pressure waves in the air. There's quite a lot of interesting things we can do to that. There's quite a lot of systems that are nonlinear in this domain. It's the kind of domain that musicians are fairly happy with. And then electrical charge and current is a different domain. We have translations between these domains. So as I said, this third chapter is kind of just highlighting the entry into more unconventional audio signal and indeed musical signal processing. Without many solutions or many distinct outcomes right there. So chemical sensors, actuators, this seems to be the fresh domain. In fact, again, I'm weak with names. There's a Greek guy who produces modules with essential chemical processes going on that actually transform audio, that transform sound. So you can actually take the sound from pressure waves to electrical charge and current, which is the standard thing, back and forth. And then chemical domain seems to be exploding in this application. I would add to that that imaging is also a very interesting domain to consider because of extracting shape and because of essentially geometrical relationships. So I have been talking about geometrical relationships just now. So it is a kind of an imaging principle on top of a basic analysis of frequency and time. So I think these translations between domains can be very interesting. And then, you know, trying to contextualize this in terms of the uncomputing and in terms of tools for artists, intervention is crucial. Okay, and the ability to intervene in an unpredicted way. Okay, I think that's totally crucial for an artist to find a unique expression. Now, we could open up the discussion whether finding unique expression is needed or necessary or possible. But typically, the conventional strategies and exploitation of those is something I would label craft and delineated fully from art, which to me, by definition, has to challenge the conventions. And that's the really tricky thing here, because if you create a tool for an artist, you're giving the artist the convention. So he cannot be an artist with a given tool unless that tool has these properties which allow it to go beyond itself, beyond what it was designed to do. Like the floor tom, it's designed to.
The audio anyway.
Oops.
Because I just.
Oh, my audio recording here has just stopped. Let me run that again. There we go. Cool. Back on track. So you see what I'm saying? That's this biggest challenge of designing these technologies, is that designing them actually defeats their purpose. But the nice thing is that this design principle, again, is a subset of evolution. So you can't really defeat it anyway. You can't really get out of the fact that it will grow. It is just that in this very limited framework, it seems like we're fixing something. And we are totally obsessed by fixing it in the exact way that it has to be fixed. But actually, we cannot escape the fact that it will grow, my body will decay, and all the rest of it. And that spasm about fixing stuff is a really interesting thing to tackle artistically, because releasing these spasms, I think, is definitely the, where the evolution pulls us to, right? So again, I would consider that in this domain, I'd rather use the metaphor of pulling from the future than pushing from the past. But actually, both pushing and pulling are concepts. They are, product of embodied thinking. So it's either model will never cover the full reality. Both of these models will reflect the reality to a given extent. And therefore, there is no reason to be a slave to these concepts. So it doesn't have to be this or that, which actually defeats all possible antagonism. Like I said, is it an antagonism that an animal eats or indeed tortures another animal? It might be, you can call it an antagonism, and you don't have to. And actually calling it anything is already truncating it, which is fun, which is part of the game we play, and something that might increase our ranking. Chapter number 3, done with. Yoo-hoo, I'm still going. I'm not gonna look at who's still logged into this lecture. I might be all alone, except I don't really sign up for this isolation principle. Okay, so this is the chapter that could become really lengthy. Because it is supposed to invite people who are expert in unconventional computing and who know details about different substrates, about different domains, how they seem to produce behavior that we can consider to be computation. But indeed, every process can be considered to be a computation of one or the other thing. The question is, what are we excited about computing and whether we consider it meaningful or not, which is probably cultural to start with, but definitely a neurological phenomenon, so nothing beyond that. So let's see how deep this takes me. I'm still fine, so no break, here we go. It's really funny. In a lecture theater, I typically collapse after an hour and a half, and like this, I can go on for 3 hours is pretty much my mark. That doesn't even exhaust me in the end, but let's see. So transformations of rhythm and pitch. So this is actually what I've shown you in terms of how, if we necessitate truncation, how we can actually twist things around anyway. So we are not hooked to this basic convention to start with. And in fact, there is some reasoning behind claiming that the temporal and spectral proximity is not a useful way of organizing rhythm and pitch. So in terms of transforming these domains, evidently you could use either of these representations. In terms of transforming discrete events, it is actually quite tricky because typically all of the kind of unconventional stuff is continuous, and I would question whether truncating and whether thresholding that continuum in order to regain the truncated representation, whether that is whether it provides a direct relationship. Okay, so what I've actually been saying is that the tools which give the artist a direct relationship with the medium will provide this tackling of boundaries, this artistic escape from the convention. And if there is a truncation and thresholding which somehow squeezes in a continuum, then we're actually likely to have to design the system to have this ability to provide the artist with the possibility to defy convention. And then on top of that, I've also highlighted how within this digital domain, within this digitization process, you can actually produce an evolving self-adaptive system anyway, which is fairly exciting too. So there's really a lot of ways to depart from the paradigm of control. Okay, so the paradigm of agency, of the artist knowing what the art is instead of being able to produce art. And I would think that knowing can embrace craft, but cannot embrace art. So even in my attempt to analytically approach defeating conventions, I'm being really crafty about it. And if I actually do it, then I'll just do it. I wouldn't spend time analyzing it. Okay, so this rhythm and pitch transformation is interesting because it actually highlights how these domains work out. Now, all of these other domains, well, essentially what I've tried to do here is, actually audio signal processing is the thing that I would wear, you know, on my t-shirt and, you know, identify myself with, and, you know, and wake me up at 3 a.m. and I can probably make a whole lot of sense in audio signal processing, whereas I would probably fail to do any other cognitive ability. So it's probably the most deeply entrenched understanding of stuff that I have, which also brings a degree of arrogance with it. I kind of, yeah, I figure, so what? Which means that I'm probably missing out on some really crucial developments in the recent years. And anyhow, exposing all this invites flourishing in that domain. But indeed, what I'm attempting to do here is define the core operations that make up all the audio signal processing that we know. Now, with audio signal processing, it's quite interesting the fact that maybe 90% of digital techniques are actually built on the analog processing paradigm. So the kind of stuff that we are able to do to audio signals with analog circuits is the kind of stuff we're trying to do digitally. And there are a few things that are strictly possible in the digital domain. But the paradigm, the way of thinking about these signals has everything to do with analog representations. So, you know, obviously, what do you need in terms of everything you need in processing audio with analog electronics? Well, you need silicon, you need copper, you need you need capacitors, you need coils, you need resistors, you need semiconductors. Do you need anything else? You can probably get away with those. I'm not a total expert in this field, but essentially there's a limited set of basic tools that build up very complex things. And a similar thing calls for digital domain. In fact, you know, not AND gates, right? You can build everything on a few logical gates. So all the fancy algorithms are just complex configurations of very basic logical gates. However, you know, these are the two very distant extremities. So what I would like to do is actually find a level which is more practical for audio signal processing. And at that level, the crucial transformations in the digital domain are addition, multiplication, and delay. It seems that these three are sufficient to build up all of the signal processing wiseness in this domain. And therefore, what I'm trying to do here is highlight this to the unconventional computing community, because the degree to which we can produce similar processes. So part of the motivation is here not to do the same thing that we can do digitally, but much slower and much less cost effective and all the rest of it. The idea is that we can produce similar systems which are much more manipulable, which are much more prone to defeating artistic conventions, which allow unpredicted ways of intervention. Because that's the point. If I have a synthesizer that is actually a biological entity made up of biological tissue, well, what happens if I take it to the moon? What happens if, you know, then this whole domain of influence is extended, right? Because that's what we're looking for in producing these tools for art, is something which can be manipulated in ways which were not predicted at all. And that's the interesting thing here, okay? So evidently most of the weird things that we come up with in terms of transforming signal will have a spectral characteristic, might have a resonance. It might be worth thinking about passive systems and active systems as a basic distinction. Because an active system, a system that can transform an energy from another domain and inject it into the target domain, kind of reinforcing the amount of energy in the domain where there is a circulation. These systems are also crucial because the feedback is crucial for creating such adaptive things. However, it comes to mind now that, you know, the word active in its definition is also a funny one, because it implies that the energy preservation does not hold. Because if I use electricity to amplify acoustic energy, well, it's not active, it's just transforming from one to the other. There's nothing active about it. It's still a passive system. It just has a, you know, it has very small impedance for the electrical energy to be transformed in that specific way, but it's not active in this basic idea that it does something which originates from itself. Which is really interesting, because I think the cell splitting in biology, I'm not an expert here, but this kind of cell splitting idea, you know, and maybe even the atomic fission and fusion, you know, is there such thing as active in the way we conceptually kind of appreciate it? It's an interesting thing. Okay, but in any case, I'm typically considering thus the basic tools that I find we could discover in different unconventional domains. So spectral attenuation is actually a fairly straightforward thing. Filtering different spectral regions are transformed in different ways. Now, distortion, as we call it in audio signal domain, is essentially a non-linearity, which again it's a ubiquitous in unconventional substrates and configurations. And it's definitely a crucial element. Now, the one that is, I think, the trickiest is the delay. Okay, so it seems to me, from what I've discovered so far, that it is horribly tricky, because the kind of relationship of magnitudes embedded in this concept make it almost impossible to do in an analog way, to delay the sound with the time delay that is significant to our musical domain, right? So that may be an echo. Delay a sound by a second is something that seems to be really tricky in analog domain. So I really hope that some unconventional scientists jump in here and figure it out and tell us how to actually produce an analog delay. Because what people call an analog delay actually has a truncated time domain. So it's a bucket brigade delay, and it relies on truncating the time. So it's not continuous. So it seems that the frequency that the set of frequencies that relate to audible sound is magnitudes below the duration that is musically interesting. So if you have a substrate which would delay the signal, which actually would slow down the transmission sufficiently, will not leave any of the original signal intact, because the amount of resistance it has to encounter in order to be delayed that much is way above the amount of resistance that just annihilates it. So I think it's a very interesting and challenging thing. Probably, you know, with really low temperatures, there is some extreme substrates that might provide a truly analog delay, but I'm not aware of any. And delay is totally crucial for designing audio signal processing. So this is probably the biggest challenge in this domain. Okay, now the other bits here that I'm highlighting are actually typically the things that we build from the basic building blocks, nonlinearities, kind of attenuation, and the spectral characteristic. I've kind of combined the two there, and the delay. These seem to be the most necessary, and indeed in producing dynamic nonlinearities. So typically, you know, stuff that producers use, dynamic processors, compressors, things like this. These are things that can be, that could be found in substrates without them being built from these building blocks. And that is the interesting thing here. So because I'm contextualizing this for non-audio signal processing experts, I will briefly talk about these, or at least the dynamic, the kind of dynamic processing, what it actually does. So the simple way of putting this is that we have a signal which is of relatively high frequency. Then we derive a signal which describes this signal at a much lower frequency, which is what we call envelope following. And then this envelope following, so I will call this an EF, envelope follower. This envelope follower will be inverted. So I'm describing a compressor here. We invert the envelope follower and it controls the attenuation, which is a multiplier of the original signal. So we're splitting the original signal, deriving the envelope, which is typically, well, depends if you're into electronics or maths, but absolute value in maths, rectification in electronics. So you make all the negatives, so typically audio signals are bipolar, so all the negative bits go positive, and then a low pass filter essentially will produce a slow correlate to this fast signal. And in fact, there are more interesting envelope followers. So we have the instantaneous envelope follower, which is actually working with 90 degrees phase shift with quadrature processing, which is the next one up. So there's different ways of deriving this envelope of a signal. Now, again, what I'm proposing is that we find unconventional substrates and configurations which have this behavior by default, which is the characteristic of these entities, rather than pushing a given entity to produce something which is accurate like that. Okay, so again, instead of defining goals and measuring the achievement of those goals, we are just continuously playing because that play is the goal in itself and it fulfills itself in every possible moment. So in that sense, what I'm proposing is that the unconventional audio signal processing is not about mimicking what we already have. It is about trying to describe what we have and what is perceptually significant in a way that we can find similar behavior, similar processes elsewhere, and latch onto those processes, because if those processes are laid out bare without pushing them to conform to the expectation, then it becomes a really fruitful artistic domain, because as they are bare, the barest possible expression is likely the one which is the most manipulable one, which allows the limits to be challenged, which allows for unpredicted manipulation, unconventional artistry. Okay, and that's why I'm really trying to kind of make a fuzzy description of these things and try to do this at two levels. Now, this is the selection I came up with, kind of brainstorming. I do think that if this does trigger deeper research and an investigation, that this will by no means prove to be exhaustive, but I'm just trying to highlight the method and the potential of such developments. Okay, so yeah, this is my basic compressor. There it is. And what it does pretty much is it takes the peaks and it rounds them off. It compresses the dynamic domain. You have expanders as well. But this idea that, that there is a description of the signal, that there might be a substrate which will do the envelope following, is really exciting. And I do think they're there already, and I do think some of the experts know exactly what it is already. And I'm also quite convinced that they haven't tried to apply their understanding to this domain, which is the invitation that I'm extending here. Okay, so that's that. There is one more thing I'll squeeze in here. It's not in here. I've been reading on some unconventional computing in the meanwhile, since I came up with these things. And actually one of the really interesting things is frequency shifting. In fact, I have found some claims that certain unconventional configurations can produce frequency shifting. Now, in the audio signal processing domain, we actually distinguish frequency shifting from pitch shifting. And the main difference is that the frequency shifting does not maintain harmonic relationships. So you could describe it as adding a given frequency to every existing spectral component, which means that a harmonic relationship between 100 Hertz and 200 Hertz is not preserved, because if both are added 20 Hertz, I get 120 and 220. And the harmonic relationship would be preserved only if I actually multiplied the frequency of every spectral component with the Hertz value. Well, not necessarily Hertz value, just a no unit value, right? I don't want to end up with the unit Hertz square. 1/second would confuse me a bit, but never mind. We're not being very accurate. There's no authority which will kill me for being inaccurate, I hope. So those are the two things that we have in terms of shifting spectral content. And then evidently, we have the kind of amplitude modulation, which allows us, which is the standard kind of radio frequency transfer, the frequency modulation as well, which also allows us to shift the signal into a different spectral region and bring it back. Okay. Curiously enough, the decoding for amplitude modulation is indeed envelope following. Okay. And the decoding for frequency modulation is frequency following. Let's put it that way. which is another interesting thing that might hopefully be discovered in one or the other unconventional configuration. So the idea is that the regularity of a signal is something that is extracted. Well, I shouldn't be saying extracted, something that is latched onto, so that the regularity is kind of separated from irregularity. And once the regularity is extracted or separated, then the period of that regularity actually comes back as a magnitude. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that if this is a fixed frequency, I have a higher frequency here and I have a lower frequency after, this would yield a signal which goes up and goes further down right there. Okay, so that would be a kind of a frequency following principle, which is definitely usable in audio signal processing. Now, in terms of AM and FM, so AM is probably something that is just kind of a variable attenuation. So if there is a substrate which attenuates the transmission based on a property of the substrate which can be modulated, that seems possible or available in many different unconventional configurations. Frequency modulation itself would entail that, well, actually frequency modulation is twofold, because in audio synthesis, we use it to describe the way signals are generated. But actually in processing signals along this concept, we are better off calling it phase modulation. And phase modulation is typically implemented by a modulated delay line. Okay, so the delay is crucial. I mean, I've highlighted how difficult it might be to have a truly analog audio signal delay. And then to have one which is modulated by a different signal, by a property of the substrate that can be controlled dynamically at a sufficient rate. That's probably a challenge on top. However, the range of delay times that we would need to produce phase modulation type effects is much smaller. It is actually in the order of magnitude, which relates to audio. So it is probably less challenging than to make a 1 second delay. I think to make a 1 second delay, it seems to me, for the spectral band that we consider audible, is truly challenging in an analogous unconventional configuration. Okay, so quadrature processing, well, the key thing there, I mean, if someone finds a substrate that does a 90 degrees phase shift, I'm gonna, I don't know, it's difficult to promise a reward. I don't want a reward. I'm gonna try my best to convince that person that the rewards are not worth going for, okay? That might be the most meaningful thing to do. So a 90 degrees phase shift is very key. I mean, many processes would require this. What is the difference here? Okay, so in the situation when I discuss a delay, what happens is that all the different spectral components, so I will draw, hello, I will attempt to draw a decomposed signal. Is that my pencil? Okay. So I have a high frequency component, I have a low frequency component, and I have a very low frequency component. So that's my decomposed audio signal. So when I talk about delay, what I'm talking about is absolute shift in time. of the whole signal. When we talk about phase shift, we talk about a time shift which is relative to the frequency. So for a low frequency one, let's say a 90 degrees phase shift would be this amount of delay. For this frequency, 90 degrees phase shift is this amount of delay. And for this frequency, the 90 degrees phase shift is even shorter, although that arrow doesn't look much shorter. And that, from my horribly basic and intuitive understanding of the field, it actually seems slightly more feasible than the absolute delay. Because I imagine the order of magnitudes that describe audible signals by necessity, by physical necessity, have a different behavior. And to induce a uniform behavior like this, which would produce an absolute delay, it seems more challenging to my intuition. Okay, so quadrature processing, phase shifting versus delay, interesting. Integration, discrete integration. In all honesty, I have no clue what I meant there. So I'll just skip that. And finally, I'm about to hit the 3-hour mark and that will be it. Transient processing. So this is a very high level audio signal processing strategy, which is not even very popular. And it kind of says what it does. It's supposed to transform transients, so onsets, typically percussive instruments, in a way that modulates them meaningfully. Okay, so the basic transient processor, what it has two dials, one for the attack time and one for the delay time. So typically an acoustic event, a percussive one, would have some kind of buildup of energy and some kind of decay. And if I describe that process with an envelope, it looks like this. And we describe this envelope by claiming that there is, my pen is freaking out. 3 hours is far too long. So we have an attack time and we have a release time or decay time, whichever one you like. I won't go into the meaningful distinction between these two terms. So, and typically what a transient processing algorithm does, it allows us to shorten the attack time or indeed extend it, and same for the decay time, make it shorter or extend it as well, which I do intuit could be found in certain substrates. So typically the buildup of energy could be halted before a certain threshold. So I could imagine the energy that is kind of slowly building up is facing a threshold value, a limit. And once it crossed that limit, then it all bursts out, okay? So that would actually produce a shorter attack time. And similarly, I can imagine substrates and unconventional configurations, which would allow for the energy to build up, but allow it to build up much slower, and actually would not compromise in terms of the buildup itself, which means that it wouldn't start to decay off as soon as the incoming signal starts to decay off right here. Okay, so it will actually kind of delay, right? But progressively delay, kind of integrate in a sense the incoming signal. And then the question is, you see, because here I'm actually talking about two different frequency domains. One is the audible frequency and the other one is the temporal description. which are magnitudes of order apart. And that makes it challenging. So I can imagine that the substrates which allow for this process are fine if I'm describing the amplitude only, but if I'm actually transmitting the signal itself, then that kind of substrate might indeed annihilate the signal altogether. And indeed, you know, we can always be inspired by the data flow of the audio signal processors, and indeed put an envelope follower in there and connect it up in a system that does this or that. But I think that before we get to that level of unconventional audio signal processing in terms of combining the elements, there should be extremely exciting undiscovered things in terms of the core elements themselves. And that's what I'm proposing here, that in these unconventional domains, there might be processes which actually by default provide what we normally consider a configuration of basic building blocks. So kind of finding transmission substrates, configurations that do this indivisibly, right? A substrate that compresses this. And in fact, the aloe vera, which is my first attempt to figure out what it does something like this. It does compress the signal. So by the property of the domain, it already produces something which is considered a higher level process. Okay, so yeah, that's the Strangian processing. So extending this, and then evidently with the decay, well, my imagination does serve me well enough to imagine a substrate that would more quickly decay the energy which has built up, and a substrate that would more slowly expel this energy. Again, the issue with magnitudes of order is potentially pertinent. Okay then, well, if anyone is still watching, hello, I love you, and thanks for being here.